Hello to you. I do hope you're well. Welcome to this themey religion, crime and punishment revision video. I'm Wardle and we're taking a look at the key words and the key concepts you need to know for the themey section of your AQA GCSE RE exam. So I thought we could start with a few key quotes. I absolutely love a key quote when it comes to GCSE RE. Remember, they are so important for your question 4 and your question 5 answers, in terms of showing the examiner that you can refer to sources of wisdom and authority for the two religions that you are studying. So I've got here for you a quote from the Old Testament, from Isaiah chapter 1, which says, "Learn to do good, seek justice and correct oppression." So justice really important for Christians. And of course, we're talking a lot today about the justice system and how it all works. And also they're saying learn to do good, that it's important to be a good person, to do good things, but that is something that you need to learn. And that again is very important in terms of how criminals are then treated. You know, are we focusing on punishing people for what they've done, or are we focusing on their reform, on educating them about the errors of their ways and then helping them to turn their lives around? The next quote then is from Matthew 25, the parable of the sheep and the goats, in which Jesus says, "I was in prison and you came to visit me." Now, as far as we know, Jesus was not locked up in prison, but what he is saying here is that he is with those who are in prison, that the way you treat Jesus, you know, and obviously if you believe he's the Son of God, you're going to treat him very well, aren't you? Is the way that you should be treating those who are in prison, because he said, "Whatever you have done for the least of these, you have done for me." And so Christians should not just be locking people up in prison and forgetting about them, but they must continue to care for them, praying for them, for example, and thinking about how they can help them, because everybody is still valued. Every human being has been made in the image of God, Imago Dei, of course. And so he's saying, you know, you must not forget about those who you have put in prison. And we'll be looking at the prison system today and the fact that 80,000 people are currently in prison in England and Wales. Just a little fun fact for you as we start the video. And then finally, we've got a quote from St. Paul's letter to the Romans here. And it's very famous, this quote, actually. He says, "All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." So, of course, this is reflecting this idea that all Christians believe that everybody is sinful, you know, so that key doctrine of original sin, meaning that people are born with sin, and therefore you need to find salvation, you need to be saved by Jesus Christ. And as Paul writes, "And all are justified freely by his grace, by God's grace, through the redemption that came by Christ Jesus." So, of course, this is a brilliant link to paper 1 when we do talk about sin and salvation, and this idea that you are saved by Jesus Christ, and that is a key Christian belief. But I wanted to include this quote because, again, it's a reminder to Christians that they shouldn't be judging those who have committed crimes, those in prison, for example, because actually everybody has fallen short of the glory of God, and that it is ultimately through Jesus Christ that everybody will be saved. And of course, this key idea as well, that God will be the ultimate judge. So just something to start us off there, to get us thinking about the key quotes that we can be bringing in and referring to in our theme E answers. And remember, you need to know your key sources of wisdom and authority for the two religions that you are studying. So let's just have a quick overview of the keywords we're looking at today. They are here in alphabetical order. And please remember, your keywords really are key to your success in this exam. So make sure you know these keywords. And as I say, make sure you know what the two religions you're studying think about all of these keywords and key concepts. So we've got addiction, community service, corporal punishment, crime, the death penalty, still in use in 55 countries around the world today. Did you know? Deterrence, evil intentions, forgiveness, greed, hate crime, prison, law, mental illness, murder, poverty, the principle of utility, reformation, retribution, the sanctity of life, theft, unjust law, and upbringing. So let's get started, shall we, and have a look at these keywords and concepts. The first thing I want to talk about today is this key question: what is crime? Very important that we actually establish what crime is. And our AQA definition is that crime is action which breaks the law. It can be against the person, for example, murder. And we know that last year in England and Wales, there were over 700 homicides. It may be against property. So, for example, it could be vandalism, or it could actually be against the state itself. And we would call that treason. So that is what crime is. It's action which breaks the law. So that leads me to the question, well, what is the law? And very simply, the law is the rules a country demands its citizens follow, and the breaking of these will lead to punishment. And then, of course, it's the police's job and then the criminal justice system's job to be ensuring that there are consequences for breaking these laws that have been put in place. Now, this is, of course, very important for Christians. St. Paul writes, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities. And we do find that the Ten Commandments in Exodus, in the Old Testament of the Bible, there is consistency between those Ten Commandments and UK laws. For example, do not kill is in the Ten Commandments, and then it is a law, of course, in the UK, do not murder, in case you didn't know. But what's interesting is there are then some commandments which are not then UK laws. So, for example, honour your mother and father, or, of course, do not commit adultery. So there are certain differences and distinctions between that religious code of conduct, the Ten Commandments, and then, of course, what the UK laws are. So interesting to be thinking about that relationship between your religious teachings and this idea of committing sin, and then the legal system and this idea of committing crime. An example of a crime then is theft, which means taking something without the owner's consent. And of course, there are going to be consequences for that. In accordance with the UK laws. And then the other point to make is evil intentions. You know, we often, as philosophers, as theologians studying religions, we often make this distinction between the action that you do and then the intention behind it. So having the desire to deliberately cause suffering or harm to another. So it's about the intention. What were you meaning to do when you took that course of action? So I think a great example is actually theft here, because, if you've got evil intentions, your intention could be to cause harm to that person, to take something that belongs to them for your own personal gain. But then you could have a good intention, I could put it like that, if you had, a starving child, you're living in absolute poverty, and so you were walking past a supermarket and you thought, if I don't feed my child, they're going to die. They're starving to death because I can't afford to feed them. And so I might go into that shop, that store, which is making massive profits, and it's, part of a multi-billion-pound business empire. And I might think, if I just, steal this off the shelves, no one's going to notice. It's not going to affect the company, but I'll be able to feed my child, And so even though we might say that the act itself is wrong because you have stolen something, you might take into consideration the intention behind it. Your intention was good because you were trying to save a child's life, you were trying to feed your child. And I know this is quite a dramatic example, but I'm just trying to illustrate here that there are different intentions behind actions, and we may take that into account when we're assessing the morality of what somebody has done. And that might also come into play in the courtroom, for example, when a judge is making decisions about sentencing somebody for what they have done. They'll want to consider, well, what were their intentions? What was the reason they did this? So just a few facts for you, really. Fraud and computer misuse are actually the #1 type of crime in England and Wales. So that is the #1 type of crime. It's fraud and computer misuse. So my top tip is don't get scammed. Pay close attention to what you're signing up for and who you're giving your bank details to online. Interesting to note, 6.3 million crimes were reported to the police in England and Wales in the 2021 to 22 year. Although, interestingly, if you just look at that table on the right, or that chart, excuse me, I'm no maths expert, as you know, guys, you can see there that there has actually been a decrease in crimes there in terms of the number of incidents that you can see being recorded there, from 1981 all the way through to September 2022. So, that is quite interesting to be considering how crime rates have changed over time as well, and why that might actually be. Final fact for you, there are currently 81,000 people in prison in England and Wales. And as I say, we're looking today at how criminals are treated, how they are to be dealt with, what the consequences of crime should be. We'll also be looking, of course, at the death penalty as well, and the idea that actually, for some crimes, you shouldn't just be put in prison, you should actually be put to death. This idea of an eye for an eye, for example, which we find in the Old Testament as well. So yes, just a little look there at what crime actually is. And so we can now start to sort of unpack the causes of crime. So what leads to somebody breaking the law? What leads to somebody ending up in a courtroom and potentially in jail? How does this happen? We need to know these 6 different causes of crime for the exam. The first one then is addiction. That means being addicted to or dependent on a particular substance. And this, of course, can be a cause of crime. For example, stealing money to pay for the illegal drugs that you have become addicted to that you now can't function without. We've then got greed, which is another reason for committing crime, and that means wanting or desiring something or more of something. And so that could lead to theft, for example, or indeed fraud. Now, St. Paul writes in his letter to Timothy, those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. So can greed lead you down a path where you then commit crimes because you do want more and more, and that, as I say, leads to committing those crimes. A hate crime then is a crime committed because of prejudiced views about a person or group. And I've included there on the screen the Equality Act of 2010 for you, which shows the different groups of people with what we call protected characteristics. So a hate crime could be based on your prejudiced views about someone's religion, their sexual orientation, their gender identity, for example. And so it's important to consider that some crimes are based on prejudices that people have. Mental illness then is a medical condition that can cause changes to a person's behaviour. It can be a cause of crime. The Centre for Mental Health, for example, have found that 70% of prisoners, so 7 in 10 prisoners, meet the criteria for 2 or more diagnoses of mental illness. And so, that's really showing us, isn't it, the high prevalence of mental illness within the prison population. Unjust laws then, this is a legal requirement within a society that is believed to be unfair. A cause of crime if a person believes they cannot follow or must act against a law they believe is unjust. So a cause of crime could be saying that the law you're expected to follow is wrong, and so you don't follow that law, and therefore you're seen as having committed a crime for doing that thing. And then finally, upbringing is the environment obviously a child lives in and the instructions they receive while they are growing up. It can be a cause of crime. St. Paul writes, for example, to bring up your children in the training and instruction of the Lord. And this is the idea that our childhoods profoundly shape us. I mean, slightly random point, but the Princess of Wales, Kate Middleton, as she was known before marrying Prince William, she's currently launching what she's called her lifetime's work, which is all about the importance of the early years and the idea that what happens in our first few years of life has a profound impact on our entire futures, because this is the critical time when we are growing up, when our brains are developing, and when we're growing, that we are shaped, we're molded, and it makes us into the people we go on to become. Psychology, for example, tells us about attachment theory and the importance of having strong attachments to your parents as a child, because again, that will have a massive influence on how you then conduct yourself and how you act in the future as an adult. Again, the Centre of Mental Health, they say that the experience of trauma and adverse childhood experiences, we call them ACEs, is very common among prisoners. So again, thinking about how someone's ended up in prison, we're not necessarily excusing what they may have done that's landed them in jail, but it's part of our explanation, isn't it? Trying to explain and understand how crime is actually caused. And this is suggesting that many prisoners have experienced trauma and what we call adverse childhood experiences when they were growing up. And again, 70% of prisoners therefore meet the criteria for 2 or more diagnoses. So it's all about considering how is crime caused. And of course, it's really important we consider the causes because of that key idea, prevention is better than cure, that we want to prevent crimes from taking place and happening, so that we're not just focusing on what to do when someone has committed a crime, but we're trying to prevent it from happening in the first place. So minimizing the harm to all people in society. Okay, we then do need to look at what happens when someone has committed a crime. So somebody has committed a crime, they have broken the law. What are the aims of our punishment? What are the aims behind what we do next? And we need to know these 3 for the exam. We need to know deterrence, reformation, and retribution as aims of punishment. So deterrence is our first aim of punishment. It is this idea that punishing somebody will then put people off committing that crime. So, for example, the idea of deterrence is to deter other people from doing it. So it's very much about making an example of that person to then show the wider population what will happen to them if they also committed that crime. And so the idea is that you then deter others from not preventing, you deter others from committing the crime themselves. So again, it's the threat of punishment as a way to put a person off committing crime. And so when someone does commit a crime, you want to make an example of them so that they don't commit that crime again because they don't want that punishment, but also that the wider population doesn't commit that crime because they don't want to face that punishment themselves. So, for example, knowing they could go to prison if they steal. You know, if you read in the newspaper that someone has been jailed for stealing, that is going to have an impact on you, isn't it? It's going to make you aware of the consequences of doing that yourself. So the idea is that you have those punishments in place to deter people. And so obviously you're not really wanting to use those punishments, are you? You want them to have power as a deterrence, that they are deterring people. So simply knowing that that punishment is in place, for example, by reading about it in the newspapers, that is going to deter you from committing that crime. We then have reformation, which is our second aim of punishment. And this means helping the criminal see how and why their behavior was wrong so that their mindset changes for the better. So with reformation, it is all about education. Another term we might use for this is rehabilitation, the idea that you are rehabilitating somebody. You're trying to help them, you're trying to teach them and educate them. And it is based on the idea then that they understand their behavior was wrong. You know, they've got to accept that they need to reform, they need to change. If that person is saying, I've not done anything wrong, it's going to be quite hard, isn't it, to have that reformation. So it's all about then helping them to actually see how and why their behavior was wrong. So it's very much, as I say, a process of education with the aim ultimately for that person to go back into society and live a good, normal, happy life in the wider world. Yeah. So that you can re-educate them, you can reform them so they can then be released and go back into society. And then the final one that we need to know is retribution, which is the idea of getting the criminal back for their crimes. And this is the idea of an eye for an eye. The retribution is very much about revenge. It's about taking revenge on that person, getting the person back, saying, well, they've done this, so we're going to give them a taste of their own medicine. They need to be punished. They need to pay the price, if you like, for what they have done and the harm that they have caused. And as I say, that's that key idea of an eye for an eye. And we can see this in Leviticus 24 here, which is from the Old Testament of the Bible, which says, anyone who injures their neighbor is to be injured in the same manner. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. The one who has inflicted the injury must suffer the same injury. And so that is your brilliant example from Old Testament scripture of retribution, getting them back for their crimes, doing to them what they have done to you or they've done to somebody. So of course that could lead to the death penalty, the idea, and again we see this in the Old Testament, that if someone has taken a life, their life should be taken. It's this idea of an eye for an eye, paying somebody back, getting them back, taking revenge on them. In terms of the other quotes I've got here for you then, St. Paul in his letter to the Galatians says that if someone is caught in a trespass, that they do something wrong, you who are spiritual should restore him with a spirit of gentleness. So that is reformation, isn't it? You should be restoring that person. You should be helping to reform them, to rehabilitate them. It is your job to be helping that person see the error of their ways and then to reform, to change their life so they can then go back to living a better life. They can go and live a crime-free life. But St. Paul does add, watch yourself, or you also may be tempted. Carry one another's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. And I quite like that line, carry one another's burdens, the idea that you should be helping people with what they're going through, you know, so thinking about those causes of crime, you know, you should be helping them to recover from their addiction, for example, rather than just punishing them for the crime it's led to them committing. So you need to be helping people, you need to clothe yourselves with compassion, as St. Paul says, and the focus has got to be on education, on restoring that person, helping them see the error of their ways, helping them turn their lives around. Colossians, another of St. Paul's letters, chapter 3 says, anyone who does wrong will be repaid for their wrongs. So again, a great quote to talk about retribution there. And the final one I've got for you is from a UK government report, actually outlining the aims of punishment in the UK. So this is your, your UK societal viewpoint. The purpose of prison is not just to rehabilitate, but to punish and deter offenders through incarceration, including separation from family and community. So that's really important because it's saying prison achieves all three of those things. It is obviously there to rehabilitate, so that's what we call in the exam reformation, but it's also there to punish them, so it's retribution, and deter offenders. So the idea there from the UK government is that prison ticks off these three aims of punishment, that you are deterring, you are reforming, but you are also seeing retribution as well. And so that is why the prison system is in place, to fulfill those three different aims of punishment. It's really important that you start to think about your evaluation for the exam, for your 12-mark question, yeah? So start to think, which do you think is the best purpose, the most important purpose of punishment, the most important aim of punishment? Which one should it be and why? And I want you to bring in, you have to bring in your religious teaching. So think of the two religions that you're studying. What would they say about deterrence? What quotes can you use? What would they say about reformation? What would they say about retribution? You need to be able to tell me what the two religions you're studying would say about these different aims of punishment, and be able to tell me which is the best one, which is the best aim of punishment, or, as the UK government believes, should it be a mix of all three? Should your punishment actually fulfill all three of these things? Deterrence, reformation, and a bit of retribution in there as well. This leads us on then to the treatment of criminals, another key topic for the exam. And we need to know about these three different ways of treating criminals. The first one is prison. This is imprisonment in a prison, obviously. It's a form of punishment. Sorry to state the obvious. You never know. It is a form of punishment where a criminal is locked in a secure guarded building for a period of time. And as I say, 81,000 people in prison in England and Wales, I think 7,000 in Scotland at the moment. Community service then is punishment involving the criminal doing a set number of hours of physical labour or work in their local community. So the idea that you're then doing work to rebuild the community, which I'm assuming you've contributed to destroying because you've ended up in jail. So again, that's very much about the rehabilitation and the reform. And then corporal punishment, which is punishment in which physical pain is inflicted on the criminal. So, for example, Sharia law, which we see the foundation for in the Quran, talks about lashes, 100 lashes, for example, given as a punishment for certain sexual sins or sexual acts, such as adultery. So really important to be thinking about these different ways of treating criminals. Should it be a case of putting them in prison? Is that to punish them, or is that to protect society? Community service, what is the role of that? How does that help to reform them? How might it also deter people from committing crimes because they don't want to be the one having to do community service and do unpaid work? And then corporal punishment as well. So the idea of that as a source of retribution, getting revenge on that person, but also, of course, deterring others from committing that crime themselves. And of course, deterring the person from doing it again. If they associate committing that crime with that physical pain, that's going to have an impact on them, isn't it? We would expect. In terms then of some key quotes for you, Psalm 89 says, righteousness and justice are the foundations of your throne. And they're speaking to God there. So it's really important that there is righteousness, that people do the right thing, and that there is justice. And we could say, that means criminals need to be treated justly. That links in very well with what Leviticus says, do not pervert justice. Do not show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great, but judge your neighbour fairly. And so people should be judged fairly. They have a right to a fair hearing and a fair trial, but then also they should be treated fairly as well. Yeah, you shouldn't be able to just get away and have great treatment if you are rich. Every single person needs to be treated fairly. You must not pervert the course of justice. You can't be making exceptions for people. Isaiah 1, as we say, says seek justice. So the way that criminals are treated must be just, and justice must be done. That's quite a common phrase, isn't it? Luke 6 then is where Jesus says, be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. So we're going to talk about Jesus' teachings on forgiveness in a minute. But Jesus was, a great advocate for treating people with love, with compassion, and with care, and of course, with forgiveness. And so, are you being merciful if you are inflicting physical pain as a punishment, for example? So that's just something to be thinking about as well. And he also says in Luke chapter 6, do to others as you would have them do to you. So this idea that, you've got to try and think, if I had committed that crime, if that was me, how would I want to be treated? Are you treating people with unnecessary levels of cruelty? And, are you seeking unnecessary levels of revenge? So you've got to be having compassion even for a criminal. And the idea there is that they should be treated fairly, And Matthew 25, of course, as we've mentioned, parable of the sheep and the goats, I was in prison and you came to visit me. So the idea, you shouldn't just lock people up and throw away the key. You need to keep them in your prayers. You need to be visiting them. You need to be concerned for them. So that would suggest to me, that you don't just forget about prisoners. It's not just this idea of punishing people and forgetting about them, that these people still have value no matter how bad their crimes, because as I say, the sanctity of life is fixed. It cannot be taken away. All life remains valuable because it has been given by God, and everybody has been made in the image of God. So again, just a few quotes to illustrate how you will bring in your sources of wisdom and authority in the exam when you're talking about the treatment of criminals. What would the Quran say? What would the Bible say? What would Pope Francis say, for example? Make sure you know your key religious beliefs and teachings. Okay, so talking of key religious beliefs and teachings, one of Jesus's most important teachings is forgiveness. Forgiveness is also a very important teaching in all of the religions that we're studying for GCSE RE. So you need to know, what would the Quran say about forgiveness, for example. What would the Guru Granth Sahib say if you're studying Sikhism. But forgiveness, really important for this theme. It means letting go of blame against a person for the wrongs they have done. And the key phrase is moving on. Now, Jesus, as I say, we're going to talk about, he said, forgive not 7, but 77 times. What he's trying to say there is you should never tire of forgiving. So no matter what somebody has done, you must always be forgiving. It is important to prioritize forgiveness, to be forgiving, to be merciful, as we've heard, to be compassionate towards them. So you must be prepared to move on. You can't just punish them forever. And this is important because he teaches in Matthew 6, forgive and you will be forgiven. So remember, St. Paul said all have sinned. And so the idea is, if you want to be forgiven by God, you need to forgive other people. So again, linking that core idea about salvation through Christ back to this topic of crime and punishment, that you need to be forgiving to others in order to be forgiven yourself, because nobody is sinless, nobody is perfect, and God will ultimately be the judge of all people on the day of judgment. And then I wanted to bring in this quote from Luke from chapter 23, where Jesus is being killed on the cross, which is obviously seen by many Christians as something that is unjust, that, the Son of God has been nailed to a cross and has been executed in this way. And he says about those who have done this to him, Father, forgive them, because they do not know what they are doing. And so you could say, even when Jesus is going through all this pain, think about the pain, the agonizing pain of this horrific way of executing people, being crucified, being nailed to a cross. Even in that moment, he says of those people who've done that to him, forgive them. And then he says, because they do not know what they are doing. They do not realize what they are doing. So Jesus is showing compassion. He's obviously forgiving people. He's asking for their forgiveness, really reaffirming, really placing at the center of a Christian's life this idea of forgiveness and its importance. So that would, of course, be an attitude towards those who have committed crime, that you need to be forgiving of those people. You do need to be prepared to move on and allow them to have a fresh start. However, the death penalty is really important for Theme, and it's an example of where you're not forgiving someone, you're not moving on because you're killing them, yeah? And the death penalty is our final key topic. It is the idea of capital punishment. So remember, corporal punishment is where you're inflicting physical pain. Capital punishment is when you are executing a criminal, and that execution is sanctioned by the state. So it is part of your legal system that you have the death penalty in place, that certain crimes will result in the death penalty. And so we have many countries and many states in America where people are on what we call death row. They have been convicted, they have been sentenced to death, and they are now waiting to be executed by the state. Indeed, there are 55 countries worldwide that still use the death penalty. Now, importantly, we do see evidence in scripture, we do see support in scripture for the use of the death penalty. So the Old Testament, which was written over 2,000 years ago, prescribes the death penalty for 36 offences, including idolatry, so worshipping false idols, not worshipping God, and murder are given the death penalty as their consequence. The Quran, so that was composed 1400 years ago, allows for the death penalty in 3 cases: for murder, adultery, and apostasy. So we see in scripture support for the death penalty. However, modern day religious thinkers have obviously very different views on the use of the death penalty. Pope Francis, for example, is absolutely against it. He says the death penalty is morally inadmissible, for it destroys the most important gift we have received, life. Yeah, so indeed, the 10 Commandments say, do not kill. And so actually, you know, can you ever justify killing? Even if it is as punishment for something, can you ever justify taking life? And Pope Francis would say, no, that makes you no better than the criminal, because you are then committing a sin. You are yourself then killing somebody. In terms of what Gcse says then, whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. So the idea there of retribution, an eye for an eye, where you've got a case of someone's killed someone, they should therefore be killed because they have shed human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. However, really important for Christians that Jesus comes along in the New Testament and he actively how can I put this? He actively turns this teaching of an eye for an eye on its head, doesn't he? He says, you have heard that it was said, eye for an eye and tooth for tooth. So he's referring there, isn't he, to the Old Testament scripture. So he's saying, you've heard this, you've been told this, but, and then this is really important, he says, but I tell you, remember, Christians believe he is the incarnation of God. His teaching is absolutely sovereign. Do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. So he's turning on its head here, this belief in retribution, isn't he? He's saying, no, you should not believe in eye for an eye. But actually, if somebody slaps you on the right cheek, you should then turn to them the other cheek so they can slap you on that one as well. So the idea from Jesus here is that retribution is wrong. You should not be seeking eye for an eye. Importantly, Gandhi, a really important 20th century thinker, said an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. And so is the death penalty the right approach to be taken? In terms of the 2 key beliefs you need to know about in terms of for and against the death penalty, the idea in support of it is what we call the principle of utility. Now, we derive this from utilitarianism, which is a theory of ethics pioneered by Jeremy Bentham, who said it is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong. So the principle of utility is this idea that you should act for the greater good of the greatest number. So basically, you should always be acting for the greater good of society. It's all about thinking of the majority of people and what the best thing for them is. And so you could use the principle of utility to support the death penalty, because if you are executing a dangerous criminal, that means they will then not be able to commit any more crimes, will they? And so you're protecting the rest of society. You're thinking about the greater good, the greatest good for the greatest number, because you are removing that dangerous person from the world. And so they could not continue causing harm. Now, a counter argument could be, well, why don't you just put them in prison for life and give them a life sentence? But you could argue, but that's then going to cost money to do that. And it's, of course, not going to eliminate the risk entirely. They could still be causing harm potentially in prison. So you'd have to have them in solitary confinement, for example. But the principle of utility is this idea that the greatest good for the greatest number should be our key moral indicator. That is how we should make our decisions. And that could support the death penalty, because executing one criminal could then protect the rest of society from them and from harm. It could also protect them from greater harm because it would be a great deterrence, wouldn't it? So if you execute that one person, you could say we're doing that for the greater good of all society, because it's going to stop anybody else following in their footsteps and doing the same thing, because they'll think, if I do that, I'll get executed as well. So it's going to be a very powerful deterrent. And again, the principle of utility would justify that. You're making an example of that one individual for the greater good of society, for the greater good of the majority, to protect a greater number of people's lives. So yes, that is the principle of utility. The word utility means usefulness, so it's all about doing the most useful thing. And so the death penalty could be the most useful thing to do if it will lead to the greatest good or the greatest happiness of the greatest number. So it's all about thinking of the majority of people, so thinking of the greater good of society, and being prepared then to execute one person for the greater good of society. However, in stark contrast to that, you have the religious idea of the sanctity of life, this idea that all life is sacred and special because it was created by God, or because we are each unique individuals created by God. The sanctity means sacred, the idea that life is holy. And of course, we see this in Genesis, where we see that God created humans in the image of God. So this is the key doctrine of Imago Dei, that all humans have been created in the image of God. And so you could never justify taking one person's life, even if it is for the greater good of society, because every individual has been created by God. In Jeremiah, for example, we read, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you." So this idea that God has intentionally created every single person, and so you can never take away their life. That leads to the do not kill commandment in Exodus, because all life is sacred and holy, it belongs to God. And so, for example, we see a similar idea in Islam, and the Quran says it is not possible to die except with permission of God. So the idea from the surahs that it is God who gives life and causes death. God is sovereign over life, and he is ultimately going to be the judge, isn't he? So you could argue the sanctity of life means that life is sacred and special because it was created by God. So, you must never take life, because even a criminal's life is still sacred. Sanctity of life is fixed, it can't be taken away. And ultimately, it's God who will be the judge. If you believe, let's link it against paper one, to life after death, you are going to believe that God is going to judge people anyway. And so you could argue you should leave it to him to make that decision, to make that final decision about whether you're going to heaven or hell. But equally, you could say that you can't just wait for God to make the decision when the person's died, because of this principle of utility. If you just then let them carry on in this world, they could cause even more harm and more suffering to other people. And so you've got to think of the greater good of society today, rather than just saying, don't worry, God will sort it out after death. So, again, thinking of your evaluation, if you're evaluating the death penalty, on the one hand, you're going to be considering the principle of utility, the idea that it's a useful thing to have, and it's important to have it for the greater good of the greatest number in society, to protect people and then deter people. But at the same time, you've got this idea of the sanctity of human life, that it is sacred, it is holy, and so it is wrong to ever take it away. One life, every life, has intrinsic value and worth that cannot be taken away, no matter what somebody has done or how they have treated other people. And you should be leaving it to God to judge people, rather than getting involved and taking people's lives as a punishment. So I hope that's given you some insight into the key terms and the key concepts on Theme E. There are going to be more Theme E revision videos here on the channel soon, so make sure you're subscribed, and do let me know in the comments any thoughts that you have on the issues we've been discussing today. Let me know your key quotes, for example, that you'll be using for Theme E. But yes, thank you for joining me. Have a great day and very good luck with all of your studies. Take care. Bye-bye.